All right, so hopefully you're here to learn about transitioning to ADS or Azure Data Studio. And what we're going to be talking about today, as I kind of referenced at the beginning of this, is if you've been doing database development using SQL Server data tools, that sort of thing, and you're tired of using Visual Studio, you're tired of having to do part of your code in Management Studio and part of your code in Visual Studio and kind of flip back and forth, this is where Azure Data Studio is going to be the tool that can help you out. It does a lot more than just help you work with SQL Server data tools and database projects, but that is the primary focus of this presentation. So my name is Elizabeth Noble. My pronouns are she or z. And you can absolutely reach out to me at elizabeth.a.noble@outlook.com, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at SQLZelda. I am a director of database development at a smallish retail company that's got 25 stores. My absolute passion is how to make database deployments less painful. And that's really where I became focused in using something like SQL Server data tools to manage my database code. Is when I started, we were doing manual script files inside of Jira. I've worked with, PowerShell that runs script files, but I've really kind of focused on the SQL Server data tools aspect. And I've got plenty of presentations that talk about SQL Server data tools and other types of ways of deploying databases if you're interested in that. So we'll only be focusing on one today. So you may be asking yourself, why do I care? Why do I want to switch from SQL Server Management Studio to something like Azure Data Studio? And the answer really is bigger than just SQL Server Management Studio to Azure Data Studio. So there are many benefits to using Azure Data Studio. And it's the fact that Azure Data Studio helps take many different aspects of what you're working on and puts it into one tool. So instead of having to open, command line for PowerShell and Management Studio and then manage your scripts in a separate place, all those wonderful scripts that we have that we use over and over again, to either, check on server health or something like that. And then also database development. There are tons of other things that Azure Data Studio can use, and we'll kind of look briefly at all of those. But really what Azure Data Studio does is kind of helps bring that all together. What I will say is I'm still learning Azure Data Studio. I'm still getting comfortable with Azure Data Studio. So I would say I personally, in my journey, have found that if I want to do things like look at SSIS job failures, if I want to look at SQL Server agent job failures, if I want to look at availability groups, extended events, replication, that stuff, I'm still going back to SQL Management Studio for. But if I'm really focusing on that operational side of database world, then Azure Data Studio is where I'm spending most of my time. Me personally, I also do report server development and integration services development, so I still use Visual Studio, but I have found that Azure Data Studio is kind of like this nice all-in-one tool. And so with that, we are going to dive into Azure Data Studio, and we're going to start really with, just a general overview of what Azure Data Studio looks like. So when you launch Azure Data Studio for the first time, or ADS, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see, a very generic screen that lets you have some connections, work on deployments, maybe show your recent files that are open. And I've kind of cleared everything out, so we don't have any connections. I can certainly add a connection, which you see to the right. It has some of my saved connections, so I can connect to a database, to a server, and I can see what databases are on that server. You see it kind of gives me some high level stuff to look at. So, this is really more of that general querying sort of aspect where, same functionality as what we're generally used to with Management Studio. If you see, I have databases, so I can look at my databases, I can look at tables, I've got some security stuff in terms of link servers and logins and server objects. But if you notice, I don't have things like SQL Server Agent here. And that's where we get into what extensions are possible. So if I go to the extensions, I can actually search for agent, and it's going to go ahead and give me this option to install an additional extension. So that's one of kind of the cool features about Azure Data Studio is you can customize how much stuff you want in there. I know, in the IT space, a lot of people talk about, I have an application, I only want it to do so many things. I don't need, all these other features or bloatware. And this is where Azure Data Studio kind of gives you that option to control what you're working with. So it's just as easy as clicking the install button and installing. That is for some of these extensions. Other ones want you to reload the tool. And we will see if I disconnect and then reconnect. Nope. See, I just wiped it out. We'll just redo that connection. And it's still not showing up for me. So I may need to reload that, but we'll focus on that in a second. The other things that I'm going to talk about today while we're working on extensions are I'm going to install the database project extension. That's the one that I use the most. So this is the extension that allows you to have that SQL Server Data Tools functionality as well as inside of ADS. So one of the things, if you go to dependencies, is that SQL Server Schema Compare, which is, I think what the concept most of us are used to with various third-party tools and whatnot, is a requirement. And so if I actually search for schema and click on it, you can see that it is now installed as well. And then the new icon I got as a result of installing the database projects is over here. I actually already had a database project configured, but I can close that workspace. And then we can go back and see that it's all, we don't have a reference to anything in terms of what we're doing project-wise. So before I dive into projects, do we have any questions?
You are good so far.
Cool. Feel free to ask if you have any. So once again, this is a pretty similar setup to what we're accustomed to with using SQL Server Management Studio. We've also got this option for Jupyter Notebooks, which I'm sure many of you have seen, all sorts of various presentations talking about Jupyter Notebooks. It's one of the things I'm probably more excited about with Azure Data Studio, but one of the things I haven't had a chance to use as much. But when you install Azure Data Studio, it comes with a SQL Server 2019 guide that is a Jupyter book. And let me just make that a little bit larger. So it's got all these references, the same sort of thing you would find on books online is all inside of here, where you've got, various things that you can look at in terms of, diagnosing issues. And, it's got examples of things that you can run. I haven't installed Python, so that's what it wants me to do quickly. And I don't think I have that file, so it might be mad at me. Not focus on that right now. I tried to get a clean install for this presentation to kind of walk through what we were doing, but I don't want to get hung up on the Python aspect. But these Jupyter Notebooks do help you go ahead and run the various pieces, so you can kind of run and see what's happening inside of those code pieces. In addition to the Jupyter Notebook that comes with it, we also, if we go back to extensions, there's another book that's been referenced in many blog posts. MS SQL Girl on Twitter is one of the individuals that's written a blog post about this Jupyter book from Manuel Mazo. And if you click install, I did kind of go through this, and it sends you to a web page and kind of walks you through the process. So what I've done for Azure Data Studio is I've already downloaded the file. So if I go to install extension, I've got it listed here in my downloads, and I can go ahead and install it. And the advantage is that it's got Glenn Berry's stuff, it's got the first responder kit, it's got SP who is active. So all those things that you're kind of used to using, it's all got that inside of a Jupyter book as well. And then it gave me this pop-up window in the lower right-hand corner that says this is a third-party extension and might involve security risks. Are you sure you want to install this extension? And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And so now you can see that it is in an installed status. And if I go back to Jupyter, actually, if I go here and I go to the command palette, I can launch that SQL Server diagnostic book. And then you see here, it's got, let me just minimize this a bit. It's got Glenn Berry's stuff, and it's got the first responder, SP who is active. So it's got all the various pieces all together, and you see there's a whole bunch of wonderful documentation inside of it to help people get familiar with how to use those various tools. So SQL notebooks, people are already developing, but also if you're in the position where you're training people on how to, interact with various parts of your system, you can write your own Jupyter notebooks and get those deployed in a way that your teams can use them, so you're not having to retrain individuals on all the various aspects. So that covers most of the aspects. There's also, let's see here, there's a terminal window that's currently hiding from me. We might get to that later, but there's a way to use PowerShell with a terminal window as well. And let's see here. Oh, there it was. It was under open new terminal window. I don't want to open an external one, but that's one of the options, that you can open external terminal window to run your code. Let me go ahead and close out of all of this. All right, so the real reason we're here is to talk about how to use Azure Data Studio for your database source control. And where this came from was, I gave a presentation a couple years ago about database source control, and one of the attendees asked me, hey, do I have to use a Visual Studio for my database source control? And I personally haven't used SQL Server Management Studio for source control, so I didn't have a good answer. And so when I saw that ADS had a way to use database source control inside of, a singular application where a user can query a table and write code, I thought this is the answer that we're looking for. Is, this is a tool that a database administrator who isn't comfortable with Visual Studio, doesn't want to get involved with Visual Studio, can use to manage database code. So we've got a couple different options when we're setting up source control. So the first thing is, and this is really the easiest way to get started, is that you can create your own workspace. In Visual Studio, it'd be a solution or a project. And so you've got this option to create new, but really the easiest way to get started is to create a project from a database. And so in this case, I can select my database connection, and then I can select what database I'm going to use to make that project. And I'm going to just rename this database project book catalog import. And then I'm going to select a location where I'm going to save that to. And I usually put them under the same space that most of my stuff lives. So I'm going to save it under my SQL Zelda folder, under source repos, which is usually where most of my GitHub stuff lives. And then you've got the option to choose file, flat, object type, schema, schema object type. I really like schema object type. It groups everything by schema and then groups it by object type. So we'll see when we import, I only have tables created, but what you would have is you would have folders that have tables, stored procedures, views, which I kind of love, because, one of the, I don't love views, but I know one of the concerns with views is, I have a hard time telling whether something's a view or a table. And this really kind of takes that guesswork out of things. And it really helps organize stuff together so that it's easier to work with. Now, ADS uses a thing called workspaces instead of solutions. And so here it's telling me it's going to need to restart to be able to create a new workspace for this brand new project I'm creating. So I'm going to say OK. And let's try this again. I might not have been patient enough. And so now under my database project book catalog import, I've got database references. We'll get to those in a second. And then I've got my DBO schema with my tables. So I've got an author table, a book catalog table, book status, and publisher. And if I go to Management Studio, and you can see I'm just connect to localhost. So you can see under databases, I have the book catalog database, and then I've got tables, and I've got those same 5 tables: author, book catalog, book status, and publisher. So that's a real simple and easy way to set up your first database project if you've never done it before. The other thing that can happen, and I think this is also a pretty common scenario. Let me see here if I can, I'm going to close this workspace. So another pretty common scenario is that, save this workspace, is that you're sharing development with a development team, right? So you have, full stack developers that are doing database development, as well as maybe a database engineering team or a database development team. And so you're all kind of trying to coexist in the same space. And so there's an option for that as well. So if I go to my GitHub, I already have a repository created on GitHub. So let's just say I'm not familiar with GitHub. I've never worked with it. Somebody set this up for me. And they're like, hey, we all use Visual Studio. And I'm kind of like, I don't want to use Visual Studio, but sure, I'll share the same code. I can go here and I can copy the HTTPS to clone. And what that's going to do is it's going to let me work using Azure Data Studio to do database development, but it's also going to let the application developers work out of the same database project. So I get to use my tool, they get to use their tool, and theoretically we can all coexist together without having a bunch of tension about who's using what tool or how it's designed. And so if I go to, I'm going to go here. So this is the Explorer, and I have the option to clone a repository. So that's the same verbiage that was on GitHub. And that URL I copied, I just paste into here. And then once again, I need to specify where I want to save it. I think you can go ahead and set some defaults. In this case, I did not want to. And then I've gone ahead and set it, and it says, would you like to open the clone repository? And I'm going to open it. And then when I go to my project section, you can see I have a project for book catalog and a project for movie catalog. And then inside of them, I've also got this book catalog with these various tables. And then under movie catalog, I don't have anything. And if I'm concerned, oh, I don't think that cloned correctly, I can go to movie catalog and I can see that in this case, there really isn't anything for the movie catalog project. So that just kind of got started as a database project, but there hasn't been any active development on it. Any questions so far?
You're so good. I'm just watching thinking, I'm going to have to watch this again, and I'm going to like stop and start to follow along with what you're doing, because I want to do this, but I can't keep up.
It's really great. So this is all fairly straightforward in terms of getting it set up. So, once again, if I go to Management Studio, I've got the same sort of files here. And so the goal is really to use Azure Data Studio and SQL Server Data Tools to create everything that's going to be deployed. So normally what you would do is you would go into Azure Data Studio and, like here, I can go to add item and add table. And then I can add, see if I can come up with, we'll just do sales. So I can add a sales table in regards to what I'm creating. And now I've got the code saved on what I'm planning on adding to the database. This really, the whole goal of this is that SQL Server Data Tools is great for organizing scripts, but it's really not until you've built a deployment process that it's beneficial. So once you have a CI/CD process to go with this, a continuous integration, continuous delivery process to go with this, the concept is that you can go ahead and add this code, and you can build, which the build feature is really great. So the build feature, if you've ever had a database where, you know, you go in and you see that tables have columns that don't exist, and you're like, how did we end up in this situation? The great thing about SQL Server data, or SSDT, SQL Server Data Tools, and these database projects is that if somebody takes something out, or they take a column out and then they try to build it, SQL Server Data Tools will recognize, oh, that column is missing, and you get a build failure. And so one of the really nice things is it kind of helps double check all that stuff that creates some of that tension between data professionals and developers. But once you get it in here, it's honestly, I will tell you 100%, if you just put files in here and that's all you're doing, what'll happen over time, just as human nature, is that the files won't end up in the database, or they'll end up getting changed in the database and not in the source control. And so you really have to get in the habit of having an automated deployment process to go with this, so that you can check things in and it'll automatically go to where you're sending it. Now, in the case of you're working with a development team in addition to an engineering or database development team, those pipelines are usually set up by developers, by release management. So oftentimes, if you're using something that's already been built, you should be lucky enough that when you click, save and change it and everything else, that the system will handle that for you, and that you won't have to worry about that. So as you can see here, I've got an update, and then I've got this little icon down here, which is my source control, and you see that I have 14 pending changes. And so it keeps track of every single thing that I'm changing, which in my case, I cloned some information down. So it's kind of remembering that I pulled all that information down. But you see here, I've got this sales.sql book catalog /dbo/tables. So that's the real change that I've made, is I've added that script file. So I've added this sales table to what's going on. And so I can make a comment that I've created a new table. And then I've got the option to commit it. Now, this is where working with GitHub can be a little overwhelming, is you have the option with GitHub to save something on your machine without actually sharing it with everybody else. And if you're not familiar with that concept, it can be a little frustrating. The typical process to kind of make sure you're working well with everybody else on your team is just like I did, to go in here, make sure you build your project. And if you can see down here, it's got this build succeeded, 0 warnings, 0 errors. So what that tells me is I've created code that makes sense, that works with everything else in the database. It's not going to break anything. Whereas I kind of mentioned, if you had deleted a column and let's say a stored procedure referenced that column, you would typically get a build failure saying, that stored procedure won't work because that column doesn't exist. And so that kind of saves you from making changes and then sharing those changes with everybody else and breaking everybody else's database as well. So the build is really important to make sure that you're actually working with code that makes sense and isn't going to break other functionality. Now, it's not smart enough to tell that it's not going to break an application. Like if you go through the process of correctly removing, the column from everything that's referenced, you can totally break an application if the application needs that column. Those two things generally aren't integrated. But if I go over
Sorry, you have a question. Do you want like,
Sure.
I totally get where you're going. I could totally see myself breaking things. So couple questions. First, is there a way to sync or share settings between ADS and VS Code? For example, tabs versus spaces, font, SQL format rules.
I will say I am a VS Code newbie. So
Okay.
I am not aware. I would guess so because my understanding is they're built off of the same backend code.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're supposed to be pretty similar, but I'm so in love with SQL Server data tools that I never quite played with VS Code.
Okay. And then second question is Git the only option for a source control system? We're currently using Azure DevOps with Visual Studio SSDT.
I think you can. I do have an Azure Data Studio one, and I think I've pulled it down because I think the only thing you need when you set it up is the clone URL. If I have time at the end, I might see if I can clone that down. But I would expect that you can because they generally tend to work interchangeably, in my experience.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to commit these changes. And one of the things that'll happen here is that there's actually this option to stage your changes. I usually, like if you're in Visual Studio, it kind of doesn't really pop up as an option. It just commits them. But in Azure Data Studio, it gives you like this extra step of you can save your changes and stage your changes and then sync it up. So we're going to go ahead and do this. And there are no stage changes to commit. Would you like to stage all your changes and commit them directly? Which is, for me, yes. Like I'm comfortable with every change that I'm making. So I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. And then I've got this option here. This is another thing that's a little tricky with GitHub, and it works the same with Azure DevOps, is you've got this option to pull, push, commit. So it gets a little overwhelming, and you've also got sync. So typically when you're working with anything that's kind of GitHub Azure DevOps related, the best practice is to pull first. And that's to make sure that if anybody else is working on the same branch that you're working on, that you're not kind of having this collision with changes, so that you're getting the most up-to-date version of the branch that you're working on. And in this case, since I forgot to create a new branch, if I pull, everything will be fine because there already is a main branch up on GitHub. So I can pull and then push, or there's also this option to sync, which does the same thing. It pulls and then pushes. So we'll go ahead and pull down, make sure there aren't any changes, and then we will push. And what'll happen is right now, what it's doing is it's taking that new table, DBO sales, and it's sending those changes up to GitHub. So if I go back to GitHub, and presentation really wants to show you all that it's here and doing stuff. Okay, go back to GitHub. You see that book catalog had a change 2 minutes ago. And if I go to DBO tables, you see that I now have the sales table up there. And so that's kind of the really cool feature, is it lets you work together and kind of keep all of that information together. And that's really where you're going to have good communication with the people you're working with. So if you're working by yourself, it's a little bit simpler. But if you've got several different teams working on the same database project together, you all, before you get started, kind of have to sit down and figure out what your process is going to be. And that's where we get into what is referenced as branching and merging. And so branching and merging are how essentially everybody can interact with the same database without having one person, overwrite or break everything else that somebody's working on. And so, like, for instance, if a development team and a database team are working on the media catalog database, what they can do is they can each make a branch, which makes a copy of the code. And so they can work independently and they can kind of develop independently without interacting with one another. And so if one person's building, tables in a DBO schema and one person's building tables in a sales schema, they can have their own development separate from one another. Now, what happens is that at some point in time, you've got to put all that separate code back together. And so that's where merging comes into effect, is how do you get all this different code that people are writing back into the same space? And so that's merging. And that's usually where people can get a bit nervous. Now, I will say my company handles it one way, and it is not the way that you have to handle it. If you were here at the end of the previous presentation, they talked about, do what works for you. It's really the same sort of thing in branching and merging, is that this is where having good communication between the teams or between whoever's using the source control is really important. Because I know I've talked to Steve Jones at Redgate, and he's mentioned, when they do branching and merging, that they have a policy that they have to basically merge back within a couple of days at most. My company doesn't do it that way. We actually keep our branches open for several weeks, which means that we tend to sometimes have more merge conflicts than Steve probably experiences. And so what happens with that is you just need to understand that going in, is how is that process going to work and how is it going to look? So I'm going to walk through an example of what that looks like, not code-wise, but functionally. So I've got this concept where I'm going to have two feature branches, which are basically like a single thing you're developing, right? So if you're making a brand new report or a brand new, maybe adding some functionality to an SSIS package, or you're changing a bug, all of those would usually be a feature branch. A feature branch is just one small little piece of code that you're working on that's very independent of other things. And so I'm going to go ahead and make a pull request from the main branch to create my feature branch, then another pull request to make, or not pull request, just a pull. You're going to make a pull from main for your first feature branch and a pull from main for your second feature branch. In my company, we take all of our feature branches and then we merge them to what we call a release branch. And that's how we control what is being released. So, I think the gold standard is you're always deploying everything that you're building. We personally have found that doesn't work for our environment, partly because things aren't being built to be deployed whenever. So we've got to make sure that we deploy things when they're ready to go live. So that's why we've kind of implemented a different process. And I will say it probably has created a little bit harder work and a little bit more communication, which is why I would not say this is, you don't need to go back to your office and tell everybody this is the way to do it, because I think you kind of need to know what you're getting into. So I'm going to go ahead and do a pull to make a release branch. And with the release branch, I'm then merging this first feature branch into the release branch and the second feature branch into the release branch. So I'm taking two different sections of code and putting them together so that they exist together. And for my company, we deploy off of the release branch. And then after we're happy with what's deployed, we go ahead and merge that release branch back into main. And I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions, because I know this may seem a little out there if you haven't experienced this.
You don't have any questions, but Ree said that she's going back to the office and telling everyone that this is how you have to do it. So you must be right.
Stop the presses. Everybody's got to do it this way. You all should be very thankful that I think I took out of here how we do ours, because I definitely got some head scratches when Grant Fritchie saw it. He was like, okay, that's a lot.
No, you're good.
Okay, so we've got a couple different types of branches. They honestly look exactly the same. They're really how you think about them. So you don't make a branch called feature and a branch called release. It's how you functionally work with them. So features, kind of like the smallest concept, that's where you're doing your single development. You've also got epic. So like, for instance, we have a development team working on a brand new application. they probably have an Epic branch where all of their all of their development is being done on one branch. We decided to create a process for hot fixes and then a branch for releases. And I will say what you're about to see, I think probably doesn't work as well with database code as application code. But one of the things that I personally have found works best is if I'm working with source control, if I have the same process for the database source control as the application source control, it gets rid of that back and forth of, why did I have to use a separate process for this? I don't remember how to do that, and gets rid of a lot of that, once again, that tension in terms of what happens between database and application development. So this is going to be just kind of how all the different pieces look. You certainly don't have to do these all at the same time, but it's to give a high level overview. So we talked about the feature branch. You can see that that's pretty simple. You pull from main, you do your development, you merge it back to a release branch. The concept with an Epic is that you've got one piece. So say you're doing new application development, you pull from main, you make your Epic branch, you pull from Epic, you make a story branch, you do your story development, you merge it back into your Epic. And that's where, so one of the concepts when you're doing development, particularly with user stories, is that you are working with individual concepts, right? So you're going to make a single stored procedure for a single, separate item. And that's, the purest way of doing a user story. But oftentimes you end up with user stories that are dependent on other user stories. And so what the Epic branch does is it lets you do, one piece of development first. And then once you've gotten that development done and peer reviewed and code reviewed, you can merge that back to the Epic branch. And then the dependent user story can use that functionality for its next piece. So say, you need to create a table. You're going to do that in the first story branch. And then say you're going to create a stored procedure based on that table. You'll do that in the second user story branch. And that way, if theoretically, if there's something wrong with the table branch, if it doesn't build or whatever, when you try to do the merge, it'll essentially, either somebody will catch it, or when you do the merge, it'll break. And then I can't do this next piece of development. Once you're finished with your Epic branch, which, for application development, those tend to stay out there longer, you're going to merge it back to a release branch. I think at my company, what happens to try to minimize some of this chaos is after each release, the development team is expected to pull down from main and merge into their Epic branch so that they're keeping up to date with what's currently out in production. And once again, that can make the entire process more complicated and potentially a little more stressful, but that's kind of how we're working around the situation. We have a UAT deployment. So for us, the way we manage our code, we don't know how everything is going to deploy together until we do our UAT release. And so that's this first event here is a UAT release, which we call store 0 because we have stores and this is, the prime store. We'll go ahead and do a release, deploy it to production. And then usually the next day, if we get an all clear, we'll go ahead and merge that back to main after we get the all clear. Now, one of the challenges that can happen, which most people are aware of with merging, is you've got merge conflicts. And so that can be where you've got two different database objects that are trying to exist in the back end, kind of on the same line. This happens, at least the way we manage code at my company, more often than not, because of the fact that we're keeping those branches open for an extended period of time. Now, if you're constantly merging back, it's less likely that will happen and be as much of an issue. But we'll try to get into what this branching stuff looks like inside of Azure Data Studio. So if I go back to source control, and I've got this option to merge branch, create branch from. So this create branch from is helpful for epics. This create branch should be creating it from the current branch that I'm on, which I'm on main. So let's just say stored proc dev. Normally at my company, we call these the user story number. So we use Jira. So we've got, projects and they end up being those project names. But since I don't have a project to go with it, I'm going to call it stored proc dev. And if you see down here in the lower left-hand corner in teeny tiny little print, it says stored proc dev. So that's telling me that I'm in a new branch. And so in that case, it's already switched me to develop in that branch. So now I can go ahead and do some new development work. So for instance, I can go here and I'm going to add a folder because I want to follow the same process. I wanted to make some stored procedures and I put that in the wrong place. I don't know if I can move it, so we'll just go ahead and delete that. Because what I want it inside of this DBO schema so that it's all grouped together nicely. And as you can see, it let me put it in the wrong place. So that is one of the challenges if you're getting familiar with this process, is you can theoretically put things in the wrong folder if you're doing this manually. So you kind of have to get familiar with what that process looks like. So in this case, I've made a new folder, stored procedures, and I've made this stored procedure called get author. I'm not going to worry about changing the code much on it. But if you see, once again, I've got some changes that I need to commit. So we're going to do, I'll put a comment in there and then commit it. And I'm going to go say yes to staging the changes. And then if I do pull, I should get an error here. Yeah, you see there's no reference on github.com, which I can show you. So if I go back here, you can see I still only have one branch here. And so when you create a new branch locally, then you are going to have to push it the first time in order to get that updated. So we'll cancel, and then I'm going to push. And it tells me that, hey, that branch doesn't exist on GitHub. Do you want to publish this branch? And I'm going to say yes. And now if I go back, should see, yeah. So you see now I have the new branch here. And then inside of this branch, if I go to book catalog, I've got the stored procedures and then this get author table. And I'm going to try to do a merge conflict real quick, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask them while I'm working through creating this merge conflict for us. So branches. So I'm going to create a branch. Let's see here. I'm trying to get back to main. See here. And I'm going to create additional stored proc from main. So this one's not going to have, if I go to the database project, let me refresh this. You see now that I'm an additional stored proc and I made a branch from main, I see DBO and tables, but I don't see the stored procedures folder. So for instance, if two different people were working on this database together and they were both developing stored procedures, I would need to create a new folder called stored procedures. And then if I wanted to make a new stored procedure and call it get book, I've got this new stored procedure get book. And so now I've created one stored procedure on one branch and one stored procedure on another branch. And that's how we're going to end up creating a merge conflict when we try to merge these back together. And we'll go ahead and push that change. And once again, if I go back to media catalog. You see now it tells me it's had this branch with a recent change and this other branch has had a more recent change, this additional stored proc. So if I go here and go to book catalog and I go to DBO and stored procedures, I now have that get book stored procedure under a different branch. And the reason we're going to have a merge conflict potentially is that under this SQL project, it keeps track of everything that's deploying. And so if you see here on this item group, we've got stored procedures, and then down here on line 77, we've got this DBO stored procedures get book. And if I go to book catalog, and let me just go to the other branch, and I go to the SQL project and I go to line 77, this one has a different stored procedure on it. And so what's going to happen is that when you try to merge these, it's going to say, I don't know what to do. I've got two different stored procedures on line 77. I need you to help me out. And that's where, you know, that's where if you're constantly merging your code back to the same branch, you're going to get around that. Or just being familiar with, if you use a process like my company does, you just know that that's going to be one of the reasons that you have merge conflicts, and, you know, design a process to handle it. In our case, we found that usually myself or one of the database developers is the one kind of, if they get comfortable enough, handling those merge conflicts. And so that usually, if we're gonna do it the way that doesn't have the merge conflicts, what we'll do is we'll take one of the branches and merge them into the other one to kind of get that figured out so that we don't have a merge conflict. And let me just go back to trying to be mindful of time here. So new branch, make a release branch from main. So now we're in the release branch from main, and I'm gonna merge branch stored procedure. I don't know if that did what I wanted it to do. So let me try this the other way. We generally tend to use pull requests more for the merging. So if I go back to this code, what I normally do in my process is I will create a new pull request and merge the stored proc dev into the release branch, which I haven't pushed up. So let me just, I'm gonna go back to the way I'm used to doing it. So if we're doing a release branch, we'll normally just create it here, which may not be ideal for everybody else, but that's the process we're accustomed to. All right, so I've got the release branch here. This is separate from the one that I created below because I didn't push it. So don't let that confuse you. And so here I can merge, should be able to merge into the release branch. And, oh, I'm in the wrong thing, hold on. Minutes, we'll see. No pressure. There we go. I forked this off so that I could do this development without having a previous version. So I was trying to save myself some headache. All right, so new pull request. And it still doesn't, oh, because it's trying to pull back. There we go. So we're going to merge into the release branch. And it tells me that's fine. So it's kicking off, you know, can kick off a build, and then we'll just go ahead and merge that. And then when I go back to the second branch, so again, I'm going to merge into my release branch. And you see here, it's telling me it can't automatically merge. I'm still going to create that pull request. And the process we use, which I completely understand is not ideal, but it's the one that we're kind of comfortable with right now, is that I can go resolve this conflict. And you see the conflict is in bookcatalog.sqlproj. And then it's got all this stuff highlighted here telling me, hey, this is the stuff that doesn't seem right. And if you remember, I said it's on line 77, had 2 copies. And so if I go ahead and delete that out, then I have both of the line items there, and I can mark as resolved and then commit my merge. And that's how we currently solve merge conflicts. I think the ideal way is actually to pull those branches down and merge them locally and then push them back up. But I, at least where I'm at, don't have the process set up to basically push it back on developers. So it usually ends up being on my plate to fix that. So that's how you can get migrated from Visual Studio to Azure Data Studio, or just get started with Azure Data Studio doing database projects and creating branches and merging code. And for me, what it's done is made my life a lot easier in terms of, you know, working with database code and having any sort of conflict with that